The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated independent stations present The Eternal Light, a program which comes to you under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Today's program is the last in this Eternal Light series of 4 talks by Maurice Samuel, author and lecturer on great Hassidic stories adapted from Mr. Samuel's book, Prince of the Ghetto, a study of the life and work of the great Yiddish writer I.L. Peretz. Mr. Samuel.
One of the most beautiful aspects of the Hassidic folklore is the tenderness and respect with which it treats the simple and untutored. In the Hassidic philosophy, saintliness of a high order may be associated with an uncouth and even repellent exterior. On the other hand, agility of mind and even genuine solidity of learning may be associated with defects of character which turn these assets into grave liabilities. Again and again in the Hassidic stories, a man unnoticed or despised by the world turns out to have been one of the 36 saints in whose virtue the world is not permitted to perish. Isaac Leibush Peretz, whose Hassidic tales I am relating here, took up the legends which had been current among the folk and turned them into literary masterpieces, but without sacrificing their essential simplicity. He has many stories illustrating the mystery of genius, its waywardness, its unpredictability, its habit of turning up in strange and totally unexpected guise. And both Peretz and the Hasidic tradition may therefore
be classed among the profounder democratizing influences in Jewish life. Not in wealth and not in beauty and not in learning and not even in all three in combination will you always find the spirit which sustains the human spirit above the levels of the beast. The Hasidim would say that God loves to confound the wise by showing supreme wisdom in unlettered simplicity. I do not know the source of the story I have here adapted from Peretz. It is even possible that he invented it, but if invented, it comes right into the tradition, particularly in one respect. Hasidism was in love with music as a mode of worship. A melody was to Hasidim a living thing with a destiny. In our story of today, Peretz speaks not about a piece of music, but about a musician. It is called a bass viol for heaven. In the village of Tomaszów, hard by the Polish-Galician frontier, there began to appear at the doors of the houses a young man, a beggar, of whom no one knew where he lived and whence he came. A strange, inoffensive creature, he accepted neither coins nor any kind of food except bread. They noticed that he always had a far-away look in his eyes, and that his ears always seemed to quiver slightly, as though he could hear something when to all others the world was as quiet as the synagogue on the Day of Atonement before the blowing of the ram's horn. If a word was addressed to him, he started, as though he had been recalled from another world. As he became a more familiar figure, a householder or a good wife would now and again try to make use of him by sending him on a simple errand. But they soon gave it up, for entrusted with a message, he would disappear for several days and then come back with an answer that was quite meaningless. And this not from laziness or ill will, but from sheer absent-mindedness. It would turn out that he had gone about delivering the message, but on the way had stopped to play with a field mouse, and then a bird had called to him, and he had followed, and so he had forgotten where he was going and with what message. Then he had come back quite innocently to beg a piece of bread. One summer day, when the village was quiet and the shopkeepers sat at their doors waiting for customers, the young man happened to pass down the street. A shopkeeper, weary with the emptiness of the day and having nothing better to do, called the young man over for a cross-examination. First he invited the youth into his shop, but the youth shook his head, whereupon the shopkeeper sat down on the threshold of his door and began to question the other. What's your name, young man? My name, repeated the youth. Ah, Abraham, yes, Abraham. Aren't you sure? No, he didn't seem to be quite sure. There were so many things. How could one be sure? The shopkeeper grinned. And your family name? Family name? What's that? A family name. There are lots of Abrahams. Which Abraham are you? Whom do you belong to? My father. And what's your father's name? Father? The man's smile broadened. Where does your father live? That seemed to be a difficult question. After a while, the youth pointed heavenward. There. Have you no other father? No. Have you no mother? What for? Asked the youth. And then, as the shopkeeper laughed aloud, added, Can I go now? Soon, soon. Tell me, where did you come from? A village. Which village? That he could not answer. He did not know the name. And when he was asked how he came to Tomashov and how long it took him, he said, I walked and walked and walked and walked. But he did not know how many days he had walked. Can you daven? Can you say your prayers? That he did not understand. But after a long explanation, he broke out with, Oh, speak with Father. That's right. I can say the Hear, O Israel. And where did you learn it? That the young man could answer. In one of the woods lying between the villages, he had met an old man who had told him who and where his father was. He had also taught him to speak with his father and to repeat the Hebrew of Hear, O Israel. It appeared also that he did not know the meaning of the words, but the old man had told him that the father did, and was pleased when they were addressed to him. In this way he spoke with his father twice every day. Also he played whenever he spoke with his father. You play? On what? Well, sometimes he played on reeds, and once someone had taught him how to cut himself a whistle. Someone had given him a clay flute, and he had learned to play on it. And suppose you were to be given a fiddle. Red spots suddenly appeared in the young man's cheeks. A fiddle? If someone were to give him a fiddle. He wanted a big one, he said, a very big one, the kind they carried with a strap. Well, drawled the shopkeeper, immensely amused, maybe someone will buy you a big fiddle. Let's see first what kind of musician you are. Without waiting for a second invitation, the young man drew from under his tattered shirt a clay flute and blew on it. Hardly had he begun to play when the birds gathered overhead and flew in circles round the ascending music. But the shopkeeper did not look up or mark anything. The young man stopped playing, smiled, and put the flute back under his shirt. Tell me, said the shopkeeper, what did you live on in the woods? Mushrooms. And in the villages? There he lived on whatever the good people gave him. Ah, thought the clever shopkeeper. Now he had caught the youth out. Who gave you things? Everyone. The peasants and even the priests. And you ate everything they gave you? No, he had thrown everything away except the bread. He had lived only on bread. The other things were for the birds. He said that the old man in the woods had also asked him what he ate, and when he told him that he lived only on bread, the old man had been very pleased. That was why he had taught him how to speak with his father. He had come to love the old man with all his heart because he had taught him the Hear, O Israel. And suppose this old man were to tell you to steal. Then he would steal, said the youth. Or to kill someone. The old man would not do it. He was good. Still, if he told you to kill someone, then he would kill. And wouldn't you be afraid of your father? Why should he be afraid? Asked the young man, more with his eyes than his lips. Because he would punish you. For the first time, the young man laughed outright. You're making fun of me. A father doesn't punish. At that instant, the time for afternoon prayers was announced, and the shopkeeper went to the synagogue to tell everyone of his witty interrogation of the young man. The community of Tomashov had an orchestra, God save the mark, 2 fiddles, a flute, a clarinet, a tambourine, and, as the usual additional noisemaker, a bass viol. It was a melancholy little orchestra used for local weddings or at the occasional performances given by strolling players. It was also called in from time to time by the neighboring landowners when they could not get anything better for their dances. One winter morning, the Tomashev orchestra was returning from a ball. The men were hungry, They had not dared to eat anything in a Gentile home, for all the food there was unkosher. But they had, according to the custom, taken a few drinks, and they went along the road arguing, singing, and quarreling. A snow had fallen, and the bass viol player, an old man staggering under the weight of his instrument, kept lagging behind, crying out to the others not to leave him. They paid no attention. When they arrived in Tomashov, they scattered to their homes, tumbled into their beds, and slept like the dead, but not for long. In a little while the bass viol's wife was making the round of the houses, screaming for her husband. A search party was sent out and returned empty-handed. For several days the hope lingered that the man had taken refuge in a peasant house. But on the following Friday afternoon, when the storms had died down, a peasant cart drove into the marketplace, and on it lay the frozen body of the lost player. They buried him with the utmost haste before the onset of the Sabbath. The next day the widow interrupted the services, according to the immemorial tradition that had grown up for such purposes, and would not let the prayers continue until the heads of the community had promised to make provision of some kind for her and her 5 orphans. That evening a meeting was held, with all the musicians present. There was no community chest in Tomashov. It was therefore proposed that the orchestra should do without a bass viol, and that whatever pay would have been given to the bass viol should now be given to the widow. The musicians objected. An orchestra without a bass viol was no orchestra, whereupon the rabbi observed that the sustaining of a Jewish family was more important than a bass viol. And the musicians replied that the rabbi, if he would forgive them, just didn't know anything about music, which greatly offended the rabbi, but brought the matter no further forward. Then suddenly the witty shopkeeper, who had interrogated the young man, cried, "Gentlemen, I have an idea." And he proceeded to tell them of the joy with which the young man had greeted the possibility that he might someday get a bass viol. Now, wouldn't it be an excellent idea to marry the young man to the widow with the 5 children, give him the dead man's instrument and his position, and thus take care of the family? Perhaps he meant it by way of a sorry jest, but the meeting caught at the idea, and the rabbi was deputed to make the suggestion to the widow. He found her willing enough, and Abraham the beggar had no objection, so within a month they were married, and Abraham acquired a wife, 5 children, and a bass viol. The arrangement worked quite well. The couple got on nicely. Abraham never set foot in the house. He passed his time as he had done heretofore. When he became hungry, he knocked at the door, took a piece of bread, and disappeared with it. When he was needed for a performance, he turned up in time, strangely enough, and was taken along. The neighbors asked the erstwhile widow what kind of life she led with her new husband. She laughed and answered that it was perfectly wonderful. What did an elderly woman need, after all? This husband of hers ate practically nothing, drank not at all, and never said a harsh word to her, or any other kind for that matter. She did business direct with the orchestra, and got her husband's pay intact. It was perfect. Abraham, too, was quite content. At first he had his troubles with the orchestra. He learned to handle the bass viol well enough, but he paid very little attention to the music. He seemed to play all for himself, or as part of an orchestra that nobody else could hear. He would go on playing when the others had finished, and had to be stopped forcibly. In time the difficulty was overcome. Not that Abraham adjusted himself to the orchestra. It was the other way round. At Jewish weddings, either they knew what the situation was, or else they thought that besides being a bass viol player, Abraham was a bit of a buffoon. And his solo playing, when the rest of the orchestra had ended, occasioned much merriment. At Gentile dances, the musicians simply snatched away his bow as soon as a piece came to an end. With his musical instrument, Abraham acquired a new habit. 3 times a day, mornings, evenings, and midnight, he used to play the Hear, O Israel on his bass viol. The sunrise and sunset worship he offered up by the river bank in the meadow outside the village. But at midnight he came into the village and stationed himself in the marketplace. The melancholy tones of his instrument would melt into the night and steal through the doors and windows into the hearts of the sleepers. And there was something so earnest and simple and insistent in the deep loo-loo-loo of the bass viol that many sleepers whom the knock of the beadle had failed to waken for midnight prayers would start up at that sound, listen awestruck for a while, then light a candle and hasten to the synagogue. A wondrous affair came to Tomaszów, such an affair as the village might expect only once in 100 years, and this was the manner of its coming. The president of the community of Lublin and the rabbi of the community of Krakow were making a marriage alliance. Since neither city would yield to the other the privilege of witnessing the wedding, it was decided that the ceremony should be performed at a point equidistant from the two. This point was occupied by the townlet of Tomaszów. The president of the Lublin community was the host, and the first thing he did was to have a barrel full of gold coins rolled up out of the cellar for the wedding costs. Could he do less to signalize the honor he had achieved? To have married into the family of the rabbi of Krakow? Well, he would delight the rabbi and the Lubliners and the Krakowites with a wedding that would be talked of for generations. The cooks and servants and waiters and attendants invaded Tomaszów to make the arrangements. There would be guests from Krakow and guests from Lublin, merchants, scholars, high synagogue dignitaries, rabbis, and simple householders, and the inhabitants of Tomaszów would be invited along with the outsiders, because their townlet had been privileged to occupy the point midway between Krakow and Lublin. 3 orchestras would play, one from Krakow, one from Lublin, and the one from Tomaszów. The wedding would be held in the big barn outside the village. The ordinary use of this barn was to house, through the winter, the logs of the timber merchants who floated their rafts down the Vistula to Danzig. For its new, exalted one-time function, it was transformed into a palace. The walls were painted and decorated with pictures. Costly hangings were brought from Lublin, and innumerable paper lanterns. 2 immense tables were laid along the length of the barn, one for the men, and the other for the women. 400 guests. There were to be separate entrances for the men, for the women, for the waiters, and for the musicians. The main door, or rather gate, was reserved for the rabbi of Krakow and a few other distinguished guests. The day of the wedding arrived, and with it the hundreds of guests who were accommodated in the homes of the Tomaszowites. Tomaszowites, so honored, were happy and proud to give up their best rooms to the visitors. In the evening, visitors and Tomaszowites streamed to the transfigured barn, which presented a glorious scene. For when the guests were all seated, and the lamps were all lit, and the precious stones twinkled in the earrings, and on the kerchiefs, and on the stomachers of the women, and the hall was filled with the light of the Torah, it was like a vision of another world. The long rows of waiters wound in through the door, carrying the plates of fish. There was a happy tinkling of silver knives and forks against a background of happy conversation. Up at the head of the table, a learned discussion developed, led by the rabbis of Lublin and Krakow. And then there broke in the mingled music of the 3 orchestras. The flames in the lamps danced with joy. The precious stones took on a fresh sparkle. The voices became gayer, and the rabbi of Krakow leaned his head on his hand and listened happily. It was known that he was a great lover of music. The orchestras passed from a merry piece to a pastoral, from a pastoral to a religious melody. A violinist from Krakow dominated the music. The tones melted the hearts of the listeners. The orchestras strummed softly, while the melody soared and fell and rose again. It was as though a river were flowing through the hall, as though the Vistula had spread its waters between the tables, rocking and murmuring among the guests. And above the river a bird floated wondrously, and from its beak poured delicious and melancholy music, one religious theme after another. The mood of the guests alternated. There was great joy for the occasion, for the gathering of learning and piety, for the marriage of the young couple. Then would come the recollection that Jewry was in exile, and the divine glory was in exile too, and it was unbecoming to feel too happy. So for a moment a reflective sadness would descend on the guests. But a moment later, the pride and exaltation of the occasion would sweep away the touch of melancholy, and a riot of gay voices went up, carried on the waves of music which poured inexhaustibly from the orchestras. Suddenly the music stopped, as if every string had burst and every instrument fallen apart. In the silence that followed was heard the loo, loo, loo of Abraham's bass viol, proceeding all alone, as if it did not belong to the place and occasion. The astonished guests turned and saw him seated with his face to the wall, fiddling away peacefully, the only hand still in motion, loo, loo, loo. The musicians had arranged this little comedy for the amusement of the guests at Abraham's expense. Somehow the trick did not take. The musicians waited for the public to burst into a shout of laughter, but the public stared first at Abraham, and then from Abraham at the Rabbi of Krakow. The musicians had miscalculated. The guests would not permit themselves to laugh at anyone in the presence of the Rabbi of Krakow. Not that they were not so inclined. Their lips were already twitching. But they looked at the Rabbi, and they saw that, leaning his head on his hand, he had closed his eyes. Had he perhaps fallen into a doze? Meanwhile the bass viol played on, loo, 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 and an uneasy feeling spread through the hall. Suddenly all eyes turned from the Rabbi toward the central door. Something was happening there. Footsteps and voices were heard. Attendants clustering round the door seemed to be thrusting back a throng, and the guests heard a frightened whispering. No, 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 not here. There will be a separate banquet for the poor. Beggars, it seemed. The Rabbi opened his eyes and was about to say something. Doubtless he was about to order the attendants to admit the poor guests. What else would a Rabbi of Krakow do? But before he could speak, the door sprawled wide open, and the astonished assembly saw an old man in tattered headgear and tattered gabardine. A beggar, one would have thought, like all other beggars, except for the majesty that shone from his eyes and informed the gesture of his hand. The attendants had fallen back involuntarily, and involuntarily they made a pathway for him. The old man, in rags from head to foot, but possessed of the presence of a king, advanced down the hall, followed by a company of beggars as ragged as he. He came to the center, in front of the Rabbi's throne, and paused there, his company clustered behind him. The wedding guests looked on, dazed, the Rabbi not less than the others. Only Abraham, face turned to the wall, went on playing. The trembling hand moved back and forth unceasingly. The bass viol gave forth its sad, earnest tones, loo, 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 loo. The old king in beggar's garb opened his lips and uttered a single phrase, the midnight prayer. Then, Rabbi of Krakow, Abraham is playing for the midnight prayer. You do not understand or believe, but soon you will. It was in order that this privilege might be conferred upon you that the marriage was arranged between your family and the family of the president of the community of Lublin, so that you might come to Tomaszów, which is midway between your cities. And for your sake the other guests will hear and understand, but none so well as you, Rabbi of Krakow, who are a lover of music. Loo, 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 the bass viol went on, and the assembly listened as in a trance. Then suddenly the old man lifted his right hand in a signal to the roof, and the slopes of the roof moved, parted, and swung open slowly, one to the right and one to the left. Above the heads of the wedding guests, the midnight sky appeared set with 1,000,000 stars. The old man made a second gesture, and the sky itself divided, as the roof of the hall had done, and in the deep beyond the deeps a light trembled. Out of the light came music. The hosts of the blessed were intoning the midnight prayer. The orchestra of the angels played, and the melody of Abraham's bass viol mingled with the heavenly melody and was part of it. Again the old man made a signal with his right hand. The music from above died out, the heavens closed, the shimmering light was replaced by the twinkling of countless stars, and once again that gesture, and the slopes of the roof swung back slowly and shut out the heavens. Loo, 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 sang the bass viol. Suddenly the bow fell from Abraham's hand. He rose, turned toward the assembly, and recited the prayer of the dying Jew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. He recited it to the melody which had sounded in the heavens, and to which his viol had played the accompaniment. And having ended the recitation, he fell to the ground. The old man went over to him and lifted him in his arms. Carry him to the charity house, he commanded some of the attendants, and handed the body of Abraham to them. When they had left, he turned again to the rabbi. Rabbi of Krakow, it was not for a wedding that you were brought to Tomaszów, but for a funeral. Abraham has been called to the orchestra of the hosts of the blessed. They were short of a bass viol, and the old man vanished together with his company. Abraham died the next day, and the rabbi of Krakow and the wedding guests attended the funeral. The old man, they say, was Reb Levi Yitzchak, the Hasidic rabbi of Berdichev, whom they called the Compassionate One.
You have just heard the last in this Eternal Light series of 4 talks by Maurice Samuel, author and lecturer on great Hasidic stories adapted from his book, Prince of the Ghetto, a study of the life and work of the great Yiddish writer I.L. Peretz, published by Alfred A. Knopf, Incorporated. We invite you to join us again next week when the Eternal Light resumes its regular live dramatic series with the first of 13 programs on American Jewish regional history, marking the 20th year of the Eternal Light program series. The Eternal Light is produced under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. This pre-recorded program has been an NBC Public Affairs presentation.
This is the NBC Radio Network.